Okay, good morning. Time now a minute after 8 o'clock in the morning in Tokyo, Friday, June 25th, 2021. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Group morning seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize so many online seminars starting at 8 o'clock in the morning in Japan Standard Time, introducing the latest report presented by the World Bank Group economists and specialists. This morning, we are featuring a new report titled Banking on Protected Areas, Promoting Sustainable Protected Areas Tourism to Benefit Local Communities, which was just released earlier this month. With us, we have two specialists connecting online. First, Uvash Narain, the lead economist in the Environment, Natural Resources, and Green Economy Global Practice, connecting from Washington. Good morning, Uvash. How are you? Or good evening to you. Can you hear us?
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for joining. And secondly, we have Phoebe Spencer, a young professional in the same environment, natural resources, and green economy global practice. Actually, she is connecting from Denmark this morning. How are you? Thank you for joining us from Denmark.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great to be here.
Great. Thank you very much. Ubash and Phoebe are the co-authors of the Banking on Protected Area report, who listen to them presenting the main point of the report in the next 30-40 minutes. Following their presentation, as usual, I'll read your questions that you sent to us in advance. Thank you very much for sending those questions to us. If you did not have opportunities to send your questions, please do so even during this seminar using online form posted on the announcement page for this seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. After their presentation, I'll read your question and ask them to respond. With that, I would like to ask Ubash and Phoebe to formally come in and start the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure to be here to present the findings of our report. As you mentioned, banking on protected areas, promoting sustainable protected area tourism to benefit local communities. Let me start by saying that this has been a collaboration between the World Bank and the University of California at Davis. And at the World Bank, my co-author and I were also joined by another co-author, Hasita Bhamar. And from the University of California at Davis, the technical team was led by Professor Edward Taylor. So let's get right to it. Next slide, please. So before we really give you all the details of the methodology and also the findings, I'd like to share with you the main sort of takeaways, the main messages of our report. First and foremost, our report argues that countries should promote sustainable, protected area tourism to recover from the economic fallout of the pandemic, to promote economic development, and for biodiversity conservation. We argue that this won't just happen, but in order to make this happen, to make this a reality, governments need to manage their protected areas, and this requires policy reform and investment, and it also requires managing sometimes negative impacts on local communities and making these communities partners in the economic growth. And finally, we argue that governments need to start assessing what are the economic benefits of these protected areas using methodologies such as we are about to share with you in our report, because only once they have this information can countries understand the economic potential of these rare and beautiful assets and manage them in a way that will maximize their economic impact. So today we are going to, our presentation, which we will both be giving to you, is divided into 4 sections. The context, the study approach, we'll share with you the findings, and then end with some policy recommendations. So starting with the context. we are living in a time of multiple crises. I'd like to begin, first of all, by drawing your attention to one of the main reasons that got us started and working on this report. Today, biodiversity is in peril, and it is in peril globally. And for example, the 2020 Living Planet Index has found that on average, 68% decline in birds, amphibians, mammals, fish, and reptiles since 1970. So vast share of our biodiversity has already been lost, and much more is under threat. Biodiversity is often conserved primarily by declaring protected areas, and even these areas are under significant threat. So research has found that 1/3 of terrestrial protected areas and 2/3 of marine protected areas are suffering from human impact, and which is also degrading further the biodiversity despite these areas being set aside for its protection. Now, biodiversity conservation matters because of its intrinsic worth, but it also matters because biodiversity and the ecosystem services that underpin, that biodiversity underpins, are the basis of human well-being, they're the basis of livelihoods, they're the basis of a number of economic sectors, such as nature-based tourism. Now, biodiversity also overlaps with a number of areas where poverty is still a big challenge. So what we're showing you here is where poverty still exists. And this is a continued challenge for countries who need to address this and are trying to address this. But what we often find is that the same areas where poverty is often persistent are areas where you have vast biodiversity resources, pristine and beautiful landscapes, where nature-based tourism can offer an opportunity and a path out of poverty. And finally, we have, of course, as we all know, we are still living through the crisis of the pandemic, where, not only has the pandemic wreaked sort of huge human health costs and loss of lives, but it has also wrecked economies in a number of countries, and economies that need to be rebuilt. And so we are in this time of these intersecting crises where biodiversity is being lost, countries are suffering the economic fallout of the pandemic, and they need to recover their economies, all the while some persistent development challenges still exist. Countries still need to grow, they still need to reduce poverty. And so how can countries address these intersecting crises of biodiversity loss, long-term development, and economic recovery? And today, we are here to make the case that by promoting sustainable tourism in protected areas, countries can recover economically, they can lay the foundation of long-term economic growth, and they can also conserve biodiversity. And now, in order to show you how we made this case in the report, I turn to my colleague, Phoebe, to walk you through, first of all, how we did this and what were the findings of our report. Over to you, Phoebe.
Thank you, Urvashi. I'll move on to the approach next. The study objectives of this were threefold. So first, we wanted to assess the economic impact of protected area tourism on local economies to understand how, when a tourist shows up in a protected area, how their money moves through that local community, and as well how that community benefits or does not from that occurring. That's our second objective as well. Estimate the benefits and the externalities. Third, we make the economic case for investment in protected area management. We did this through case studies in 4 different countries with 5 study sites. These sites were selected based on a number of criteria, including needing a sufficient number of tourists to have a sample size that would make for good economics, and as well making sure that that tourist site, that it is really truly a site where tourists are drawn. Second, we wanted to look at sites that were either formally already designated as protected areas or that were being registered as protected areas during the study period already. Third, we wanted to make sure that governments either were recommending or had other buy-in related to these areas to ensure that, that we're working together with these clients. And lastly, we of course had to have manageable logistics for the site visits in order for this to work out well. What was also really nice about this study and sort of a more innovative approach was that we partnered with nearby universities to survey communities. So this gave students an opportunity to work in their own countries and see parts of the country that sometimes they had never seen before. And it allowed them to also gain survey skills while they were studying. The methodology that was used is called the Local Economy-Wide Impact Evaluation, or LEWI for short. This creates a snapshot of economic transactions within a local community using microsurvey data from a number of things, including tourists, park authorities and governments, tourist lodges and businesses, local farms and businesses, and then households. In this methodology, we measure both the direct impacts. So this is when a tourist arrives at a protected area and they may purchase goods and services from households or from local farms or businesses. They spend money at their tourist lodges, so they have to have a place to stay. They might, spend money on a tour or other types of activities. And then they're also probably paying a park entrance fee. So these types of things are direct impacts. We measure that. We also measure the indirect impacts. So what happens to that money that those tourists spend after they spend it? With these indirect impacts, we're measuring many more linkages, including the taxes that businesses and households pay to government but from the income generated by these tourist dollars. We can measure the indirect impacts when a park hires guards or employs households to better serve the protected area. We can look at things like the wages paid to workers that are employed in different tourism activities, but also workers that are paid in non-tourist activities that are boosted by these linkages. This captures the direct and indirect impacts all in one model, and it allows for the simulation of policies and interventions as well to improve income multipliers. And I'll tell you about that in the results too. The multiplier, I want to just clarify, is a single number that sort of summarizes the total economic benefits that result from a change in the local economy. So when a tourist starts spending money, how much does that amount to once it circulates through the local economy? And that converges on a single number. When that number is positive, that means that the overall increase in income in the local economy is greater than the amount that was infused in the first place. So if a tourist spends a certain amount of money and a positive multiplier comes out in the end, it means that money actually generated more than it was worth in the first place. To show you some of the findings and understand what we discovered through the LEWI model, first, we found that protected area tourism is good for both development and conservation. In terms of the multipliers that I just mentioned, the income multipliers range from 1.5 to 1.9, signifying quite a positive impact overall from the amounts that were spent in local economies, generated even more income locally. Furthermore, if you see below the graph there, we saw hundreds or thousands of jobs generated in each case, whether in the park itself or in the broader region. This was really important to local communities, obviously, because this employment is not just directly in these parks. So even if a park is quite a small portion of this, it's the income that circulates because tourists are there that helps support lots of other jobs outside the tourism sector as well. Next, we found that the benefits of tourism are very broad, and they do help the poor. So in all but one of the cases, we saw most of the income that arrives from tourist dollars circulates through the economy, actually ends up going to non-poor populations. However, when we adjust for the amount of poor and non-poor residents in those areas, we actually see that in all but one case, the poor benefit more per person than the non-poor. And this is important because at the World Bank, obviously, we are very concerned with reducing poverty and improving equality through what we call shared prosperity. But that this solution, looking at protected area tourism, is actually very supportive of that goal. We do acknowledge, of course, that there are costs to protected area tourism, and we measured that through the Louis model as well. One thing that is an issue in many terrestrial protected areas, so in our study that was 2 areas in Zambia and 1 area in Nepal, we saw human-wildlife conflict being an issue. This is when wildlife comes out of a protected area and might destroy crops or injure people. This is an issue that has huge economic implications for livelihoods, and often the livelihoods of the poor that might depend on their crops very much. And this is obviously an issue that that must be accounted for when talking about protected area tourism, but also just in general. So we've actually found that wildlife caused crop losses of between 9 and 14% in these 3 parks. And that totaled more than $1 million per year, US dollars, in each of these parks, and up to almost $3 million in Nepal. We also acknowledge the losses that are occurring due to COVID-19. This impacts the entire community that might rely on protected area tourism. And just as tourist spending can have these positive effects on communities, it can have negative effects once the tourism goes away. So this is felt by households that are involved directly in tourism and those that are involved indirectly, just as those that are directly involved in tourism benefit from it when it occurs, and those indirectly involved benefit as well. We saw that the monthly losses in local economies from this lack of tourism was in the millions of dollars, and hundreds of thousands in the smallest case, up to nearly $20 million per month of losses in the Fiji region that we looked at. So this is obviously quite substantial and something that we wanted to account for in this study. However, we found lots of positives of tourism as well, not just in these multipliers, but actually in the ways that the governments of these countries can invest. When governments invest in these parks, their returns are at least 6 times the cost. And actually in one of these parks, more than 28 times the cost was returned to government in various ways. So that is obviously a very positive investment for these governments. We also found that a good investment occurs when rangers are hired locally for these parks. The cost to hire these additional workers is well below the real income that's generated throughout the community. And because these employees are hired locally, the park employment multipliers are actually higher than tourist spending multipliers because there's no leakage outside the community. There aren't any dollars going to other communities as goods are sourced from elsewhere, as people spend their money outside the community. The wages go directly to a household in the community. So this occurred in all of the parks that we looked at that we had data for, that this was a good investment. We also saw that sourcing goods locally boosts economy. As I mentioned, leakages before. This is something that lots of communities are worried about how to keep their money circulating as much as possible in their own community. And we found that actually using a simulation that shows an increase in local purchases for business would have huge economic advantages in these communities. So We did find that poor households benefit less overall than non-poor ones because they have less of a capacity to take advantage of economic opportunity related to this, but that this would increase sort of the multipliers overall for these cases. I'll turn back now to Urvashi to share with you the policy recommendations that came from this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe. So just before we turn to the policy recommendations, just to recap what we have, Phoebe just shared with you. What we found in this study is that tourism in protected areas is good for conservation and it's good for development. It generates, we showed you, it generates significant income multipliers, which is a measure of economic activity. It benefits both poor and non-poor households, households directly involved in the tourism sector, but also households who are not directly involved in the tourism sector. We also found that it generates substantial number of jobs. Now, this is very important because this is a big concern for countries today as they are thinking of how to recover their economies and to generate jobs and green jobs. And so what our study has found that significant jobs can be created through this particular sector. We also found that there are costs on communities. While communities can benefit, there are costs. Phoebe shared with you the loss of crops, but there are also, say, in marine protected areas, there may be a loss of fishing income. And it's important that these costs be understood. And because not always the households who benefit from tourism are the ones who are also bearing the costs. So these costs must be managed. But there are many ways in which governments can increase these benefits through supporting, skill development and through supporting local sourcing of goods. So that is what our study finds. So now that we've convinced you that this is good for development and good for conservation, what should countries do? What should countries do once they have this information? And this is where we'd like to turn to now. And our policy recommendations fall in three broad buckets: protect the assets, grow and diversify the business, and share the benefits. So let me turn to each one of those. The first one is protect the assets. Now, clearly, if you don't have well-managed, beautiful, biodiversity-rich protected areas, tourists are not going to come. This is what attracts tourists. So these areas must be well-managed. If they are degraded, that degradation must be reversed. And these areas must be preserved to serve as the asset that then brings the tourists to this region. Now, what should countries do in order to protect the assets? We recommend 4 separate measures. First of all, countries must formalize protected areas. We know that under the upcoming negotiations, under the biodiversity COP in Kunming, China, in a few months, countries will be thinking about making new commitments on how much land, how much marine area to put under protection. And our report and our policy recommendations suggest that countries should formalize and increase the area that they have under protection. Now, this can be managed in many different ways. Formalization doesn't mean only government management and government control. It can be co-managed with communities. It can be co-managed with the private sector. But they must formalize these protected areas and declare them. Secondly, hopefully, through our report, we make the case that investing in protected areas is a good investment, and clearly it is needed for biodiversity conservation. What we are finding is that governments are setting aside land and marine areas, but they are not investing in these areas, which is leading to degradation. A study has found that investment in marine protected areas is the leads to the best outcomes in terms of biodiversity efficacy of that marine protected area. And so investing in these protected areas is important. Now we understand this is a time where governments are strapped for resources and their fiscal space is tight. So they need to find innovative ways of leveraging private sector, leveraging other resources in order to invest in protected areas. But investment in protected areas, say through public work programs, can both serve as a social protection scheme, and it can also help to create the asset that can then attract tourists. And thirdly, it's important that governments increase the capacity of managers who are looking after these very precious resources. Now, typically, protected area managers come from the fields of wildlife conservation, because that is their primary goal and primary role is to conserve these resources. But it is equally important that some of them be trained to manage business, to be able to regulate the business, to ensure that both the business thrives, but also that it is regulated so that it does not have negative impacts on the very asset on the basis of which the tourism is being created. And finally, we suggest to governments that they must undertake comprehensive economic assessments like we have shared with you, so that they can both understand to what extent is the protected area leading to economic benefits. They can also, using the methodology that we shared with you, understand what are the mechanisms through which protected areas connect with the local economy and generate these economic outcomes, so that they can identify where are the policy levers that they can use in order to strengthen these local benefits. Second pillar, after protecting the asset, is to grow and diversify the business. Sometimes protected areas are seen as only for conservation, and that has to be. Some protected areas must be set aside and left untouched. But in other cases, these protected areas can both serve conservation goals and also serve for the enjoyment of people, whether it's local, domestic populations or international populations. And so, but in order for tourists to come, they expect certain services to be provided, whether it's in the form of trails that they can then use in order to explore protected areas, or in the form of lodges in or around these protected areas where they can stay, all sorts of other tourism services, whether it's adventure tourism related or just food or handicraft. And so governments must see these assets both as good for conservation, but also as economic assets. They must look at these assets, and often in many countries, there are multiple protected areas, and rank them for their feasibility to create tourism and where they will not harm the very conservation goals for which protected areas are created. This is also important because we find that in some countries, there are just a few protected areas that are attracting all the tourists, and that is leading to a lot of overcrowding and then negative impact on the protected areas. So, ranking all protected areas, identifying all the different protected areas that can serve as tourist destinations will also help diversify the offering and ensure that these protected areas are not damaged. In order to stimulate growth and business and private sector participation, it's important that governments have very clear concession policies. These are the contracts that governments would sign with the private sector or with communities to facilitate commercial services in protected areas, whether it is to provide food or lodging or any other adventure services. Now, these protected area concessions can take the form of, can be long-term as for lodges, but they can also be short-term annual permits and licenses that allow for these more short-term services such as food and adventure services. But it's equally important that there's those contracts. Phoebe, if you could go back to the previous slide, it's equally important that those contracts also include measures to ensure that the businesses are following good environmental practices, that their business is not damaging the environment, and it's also important that these benefits are more inclusive. And so that is our last policy recommendation. Moving to the next slide. That it's very important that once you protect the asset, you grow and diversify the business, you also ensure that the benefits are shared. Now, ensuring that benefits are shared with local communities is a goal in itself, because oftentimes very poor communities live around these protected areas. So it's important for their economic growth and for poverty alleviation and for poverty reduction. But it's also important because unless local communities are partners in conservation, you will not see protected areas being conserved. And so it's important that the links and benefits be strengthened for local communities, and there's multiple ways that governments can do this. First of all, there can be direct benefit sharing. So a percentage of the tourism revenue that the park receives, say, through the visitor entrance fees, can be shared with communities. Giving communities more access to infrastructure is another way in which benefits can be shared. Then, as we have shown, one of the best ways in which communities can benefit is through the economic activity that is created around these protected areas. And governments can do multiple things to strengthen those income multipliers and to strengthen those economic linkages. They can help create upskill the labor in these local communities so that they can be employed in the tourism industry, or they can be entrepreneurs for the tourism in the tourism industry. Also, the governments can help improve agricultural productivity and in these local communities so that they can become providers of food and other services for the local tourism establishments as well. And finally, it's very important that governments recognize some of the costs that can be communities can bear, and that there are transparent mechanisms to compensate communities, and that these mechanisms are employed in a timely fashion. Coming then to the very last recommendation, we are in a time where countries are thinking of how they can recover from the economic fallout of the pandemic. And we are arguing in this report that by promoting protected area tourism, you can also help promote economic recovery. Now, why do we say that? Now, typically, a good economic recovery strategy has to meet certain criteria. It has to create a lot of jobs. It must lead to significant income multipliers, and it also should give a good return on the investment that governments make. And I hope we have shown you through the findings of our report and through this presentation that tourism in protected areas meets each of these sort of buckets of good economic recovery. It generates significant employment. Now, of course, that depends on when the tourists come, but as countries invest in these resources in the near term, that kind of investment, green investment, also creates short-term jobs. Also, tourism leads to significant economic multipliers and gives governments a good return on their investment. And so for all these reasons, we feel that we recommend that government should promote tourism as in protected areas as a way to recover. Now, a number of countries have already started down this path, and we share a few examples on the slide. For example, in New Zealand, the government is investing around $200 million in green jobs on their public lands to improve conservation. Similarly, in the United States, over $3 billion is going to be invested in parks and conservation, creating over 100,000 jobs. And there are examples in developing countries as well. In Pakistan, through a World Bank project, the government is restoring degraded lands and creating protected areas and enhancing protected areas, and thereby creating also a significant number of jobs. And so coming finally, we'd like to thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for listening to us. This study, as Phoebe mentioned, was done by a very large team, and we'd like to just recognize them. We had some wonderful, amazing, bright students from each of our countries. We also, this was a great partnership with the governments in these countries, with universities, and with a wide range of stakeholders. And we thank them all for their time and for their effort. And finally, we have put the URL of our publication page where you can find the study, our presentations, and a lot of other resources, and we hope you will visit it. Thank you very much. Back to you, Koichi.
Thank you very much, Ubash and Phoebe, in presenting the main point of the report. We received some questions from the audience in advance, and let me read those questions as we received, so we can ask both of them to respond. First one, actually first two questions that we received from the anonymous participant. Thank you very much for sending your question always. What is the effective approach to involve tourism, passenger transportation sectors and industries, and the government of tourist sending countries to congestion management, including overcrowded demand over the local supply of goods, especially public goods, and management of the mitigating tourist negative impact on the environment and society, turn tourist attitudes to respect nature and local and/or indigenous people and their cultures? So that's the first question that we received. Any comments on this point? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I can start, and then Phoebe, you can come in as well. So this is a wonderful question. Thank you. And I think it's very important through this question, the person is highlighting some of the negative consequences of tourism as well, which must be managed. And there are a number of ways in which this can be done. So, for example, we've argued in our report, sometimes this over-congestion happens because there's only a few places that tourists are visiting. So let me give you an example. In Nepal, where we did our study, Nepal has 20 pristine, beautiful, diverse protected areas. But tourists are only going to 3 or 4 protected areas, in large part because some of the other ones are not accessible. You can't get to them by road, you can't even get to them by airplane. And so then you have all these tourists who are coming congested in a few areas, which is leading to the negative impact. So by diversifying the offering, you can also spread out where the tourists go and thereby reduce some of the impact. But that said, governments must regulate and must fine in cases where there is sort of tourists are leading to a negative, leaving a negative footprint in these protected areas. We must, educate people about the diversity, about the ecological wealth, the cultural wealth that these protected areas bring, and through that urge them also to be stewards and to protect these areas and not, so both, diversify the offerings to send people to different areas, manage and regulate these impacts to make sure that they're not happening, but also finally pursue behavior change and educate people about the wealth and make them stewards and partners in the conservation. Phoebe, over to you if you want to add.
Thank you. Sure. So I noticed that this question also touched on how to involve the transport and infrastructure sectors. And actually, I think it's a very good complement to those sectors in that the green recovery strategies that Urvashi mentioned in her in the policy recommendations part of the presentation, these green recovery strategies are wide ranging. They're not solely focused on protected area tourism, but protected area tourism can be a great part of these. And one way of doing that is by ensuring that tourists and as well as people living in these communities are able to access both the parks and the goods and services needed to support those communities. And by employing people locally to help with, say, an infrastructure project that also, empowers local communities to have better linkages, they're able to have a more sort of holistic strategy toward green recovery. This is seen, for example, in the Civilian Conservation Corps that the US developed way back in the 1930s. They had these huge infrastructure projects often centered around protected areas and actually formalizing those protected areas and ensuring that the workforce was employed in bettering these protected areas and bettering the communities around them. And the economic impacts of that are still seen today, not just through the jobs that were sort of more short term. At some point, they were actually employing 5% of the adult workforce in the US. That alone, the adult male workforce, that alone was, a short-term jobs benefit, but many of the skills that those people learned were then transferred into their communities, and some of the businesses that were formed then are still going today. So if other countries can adopt something like that as a green recovery strategy, that incorporates the tourism sector, but it also incorporates infrastructure and transport and many other things as well to create jobs. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your response. Let me continue reading the second question. Regarding research, how do international organizations and universities or other research institutions collaborate with breeding facilities such as zoos, aquariums, botanical gardens, and relevant museums, and so forth? That's the second question. Any comment, please? Thank you.
So, for us at the World Bank, when we engage in the tourism sector or in the nature-based tourism sector, zoos and museums are a very important stakeholder, right, that are also part of this broader group of stakeholders that we engage with. So it is very important that when these kinds of projects are developed, that they also be included as an important stakeholder, as a way to both, of course, help sometimes preserve threatened species, but also as a way to educate the public and become places where public can go to learn about the cultural wealth or the natural wealth of a country. And so they are very much often part of the wide set of stakeholders who we engage with through our project. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much for your responses. Let me move on to the third question from Tanaka-san. Thank you for your question as usual. The question is this. UNESCO's World Heritage List is well known in many countries and keep attracting attention, attention from so many countries and local governments, and they are willing to make their heritages to be included in the list. How would the World Bank work with them in complementing each other, or what would be the best approach from the World Bank's view? That's a third question.
I think this, again, a great question. And, this is exactly, and UNESCO recognizes both cultural wealth and natural wealth, right, as key sites. And what we do oftentimes in countries, we see it in two ways. One is, we now in the World Bank see tourism as a key sector for economic growth. We recognize, for example, before the pandemic, 1 in 10 jobs were created in the tourism sector. Every 10th job was in the tourism sector, right? So it's a key sector for economic growth. It's a sector that we are working collaboratively with a number of countries. And as part of our engagement, we provide a very holistic approach to governments. We showed you what, say, from the environment side we do, where we help governments, say, protect the assets, we help them grow the business, but then, and also work with communities. But at the same time, we have other parts of the World Bank that do similar things on cultural assets. So they also work with countries to help preserve their cultural assets or sometimes to enhance, make them more accessible to tourists, help sort of grow businesses around that can both serve as guides, but also provide other tourism services and also involve communities. And finally, our approach is also to help governments deal with the tourism sector itself, right? So our approach to tourism is as a way to promote development, but through doing that, we help countries improve and secure and enhance their natural as well as cultural heritage. And then countries, we work with countries to help make them part of the UNESCO World Heritage List, because that is a huge stamp, right, of approval. And it's the kind of, once a country or a site gets that kind of a listing, it definitely improves how many tourists will come. But at the same time, we also find that it serves as a way to push countries to do better, because sometimes if countries neglect their heritage, it can fall off the list, right? UNESCO can say that if you don't do X, Y, and Z, we will take this particular site off the list. And that also serves as an incentive for countries then to change the way they're managing the assets. And that's another way in which we come in. So we help countries put their assets on this list, but we also can assist countries when, say, UNESCO finds that countries are not managing those assets and they could lose that status. And so that is broadly the approach that the World Bank takes.
If I could add as well, well, we looked at mostly natural assets in this report. There's no reason that you can't use this a very similar type of model to look at cultural heritage as well, the economic linkages that exist within a community around, say, a cultural heritage site. So that's something that you know, our team is mainly focused on environment, but there's actually no reason that this couldn't also be applied in a similar way. And of course, there are many linkages between cultural and natural heritage. And so, you know, a more sophisticated version of this model could easily include both of those pieces as well. And in these sites, as I said, they were mostly natural heritage, natural asset areas, but many protected areas, of course, have a large cultural component too. And so I would definitely recommend if countries or if study teams, researchers are interested in employing that type of approach, please look into it and you know, contact us as well, because this is it's an approach that we're honing in different areas and can be applied to a lot of different scenarios.
Thank you very much for your responses. Let me continue reading a question that we received from the audience during your presentation. Ida-san from JICA Africa Department. I'm involved in the conservation and blue economy program for Mauritius. What is your view on the lack of conservation data and the precocious nature of the tourist employment? That's a hard question. Thank you very much.
So if I understand correctly, the question is about the lack of data. And the second part was, could you repeat that, Coach? The first one was the last, oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. So the question was, what is your view on the lack of conservation data and the precarious nature of the tourist employment? Thank you.
So absolutely, I think this is a big problem, not having the adequate data, both to monitor how these areas are being managed and how the biodiversity is being preserved in these areas. But also, as we have tried to argue in our report, there is a lack of information on, how are these areas benefiting the local community or causing a cost on local communities. So let me give you an example. We, the question was about Mauritius, but, we started this study in Nepal, and we had gone to a very famous national park, the Chitwan National Park in Nepal, and we were talking to the warden, and he was saying that, I find it very hard to get resources for my park because the policymakers see my park as just generating revenue only through visitor entrance fees, but they do not see the broader economic benefit that my park is bringing, and I have no way of measuring that. And so I think this lack of data on both how well the protected area is doing, whether it's marine or terrestrial, to preserve biodiversity, but also what is the economic impact of this? And, you need to do good surveys of tourists, you need to do surveys of tourism establishments, you need to do surveys of communities in order to really understand these economic impacts. Because once the government has this information, they can then start saying, okay, why is it that this area is not generating much benefits for the local communities? What can I do to strengthen those economic benefits, right? Or, I'm surprised that this area is generating such economic benefit. Let me invest in this area to make sure that those benefits are preserved. So having this kind of information and this data is very important, and thank you very much for this question. Phoebe, would you like to add something? Over to you.
Yeah, well said. I don't think I have too much to add on the data other than, the surveys that we did for this can be quite intensive, and it's it's not something that every protected area can do every month or something. It involves a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of training of people to actually conduct the surveys. It's the time of the households and businesses that are being surveyed as well, that you don't want to oversaturate with questions every month or something like that. So we certainly wouldn't propose doing this all the time everywhere, but to actually be strategic in what data is gathered and to make sure that those things are done regularly enough so that you can have both a baseline and understand what's coming after, to see how the change is happening over time. And actually, COVID has offered us an opportunity. It's done many bad things, but one opportunity that we can find in it is that there is the sort of baseline of there's very little tourism happening right now, and if protected areas or other nature-based tourism hotspots take data collection now, actually at this sort of lull in tourism, it offers a good baseline to understand how a community functions without the tourism, and then how it functions with it. And that can also help build the resiliency of the community with the government intervention, which I think gets at your point as well about the precarious nature of jobs in the tourism industry. So to better understand those linkages and to strengthen so that jobs are enhanced by tourism and not so reliant on it that they that a dip in tourism can knock them out entirely.
Thank you for your responses. Let me read actually the points and questions raised by the various other viewers, as we received actually many points during your presentation, and then ask both of you to respond comprehensively, as we have 5 or so minutes in our limited time. First set of comments, a comment from Professor Yoshino of the Keio University. Thank you very much for your points. Thank you for excellent presentation. Tourists must follow rules to protect environment. Would the World Bank publish necessary points how tourists should follow to maintain a good environment? Education to local people would be also needed. When tourist increases, wastes are also rising. Various equipment must be prepared to absorb waste by the tourist. That's a comment from the Professor Yoshino. Thank you very much. Another point from Shiohata-san. Thank you very much for your presentation. What are your views on trophy hunting? Some argue it's effective both in economic and conservation terms. So that's the comment from Shiohata-san. And lastly, points from the Professor Shibamoto from Kyoto. Thank you for your points. When you talk about educating people, do you also include the tourist companies per se, perhaps? What is your take on inclusive tourism as a new business product, as it were? So these are the points from Shimamoto Sensei. Now, for the rest of 5 minutes or so, I would like to ask both of you to come in to respond comprehensively, and then we wrap up our seminar. Thank you very much.
Phoebe, why don't you go first, and then I'll come in.
Sure. Well, I'd like to address especially the first comment that you were talking about with how tourists can sort of follow the rules to protect environment, and you know, how things like tourist created waste and other sort of harm to the environment can be mitigated. And that's something that we talk about in the report a lot. So I would definitely direct you to that for specifics. But for example, in Nepal, we heard that the waste that tourists generate, the trash, is actually quite difficult to manage because there's not a system in place to sort of mitigate that. There is actually a World Bank note written on that specifically. That type of information can help inform a government response and an approach to better not just the tourist experience, but the local local economy and the local communities that are dealing with these negative impacts of tourism. Of course, tourism doesn't have all positive benefits, as we talked about with human-wildlife conflict and with the COVID-19 impacts. But waste, of course, is another one, and as well, you know, negative impacts on these assets that are protected in protected areas. You know, making sure that biodiversity loss isn't spurred by tourism is very, very important to this whole pitch kind of how to best employ protected area tourism. So maintaining the asset is one of those main pieces, and actually bettering it that we talk about. But it's also about ensuring that communities are not negatively impacted. Urvashi, I'll turn over to you, as I know we're short on time.
Thank you, Phoebe. So let me take the other questions. I think I really liked the way this the question was posed about inclusive tourism. I think when we defined it in our report, we were thinking really about inclusive in the sense of local communities. But I think it's rightly pointed out that engaging the private sector and making them partners, both in, of course, providing the services, but also becoming stewards for the resources. You know, for example, in some areas, private businesses that are particularly environmentally conscious get sort of a special, you know, are allowed to use the park services, you know, emblem on their products, and to use that as a marketing strategy. And so making, you know, there's different ways of making the tourism inclusive, and I think that is a point well taken. And then finally, on, you know, the trophy hunting, there are consumptive and non-consumptive ways in which communities can benefit from wildlife. And our focus on tourism is because it's a non-consumptive way in which communities can benefit, including, say, through photography and other non-consumptive ways. But we don't deny that sometimes consumptive use of wildlife can also be very beneficial to communities. But then it's important that that be regulated properly and that those benefits really go to communities, that those benefit sharing is strengthened and is transparent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With us this morning from Washington, D.C., Uba Shinarian, leader economist, and from Denmark, Phoebe Spencer, young professional, both from the same environment, the natural resources, and green economy global practice of the World Bank. Thank you very much for both of you spending your time to present the report and respond to all the questions that we received from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. This concludes our morning seminar in the first half of the 2021, and I can't believe time flies so fast. In fact, the World Bank's fiscal year starts in July every year, so this is the final session in the World Bank fiscal year 2021. We will continue organizing morning seminars in a virtual format, and please check our website for the latest information. Thank you very much once again for tuning in. Stay safe, stay healthy, and see you next time. Thank you very much.